All right, so before we jump into finishing chapter 16, and I'm sure we'll get a little bit into chapter 17 today, before we do that though, let's just take a quick look at the syllabus again. Just as a reminder, today is April 27th, so the end of this month. We've got just two class periods left, and then we've got our final exam. So we'll be starting chapter 17 today, and then we'll finish that on Thursday. We'll be able to go over the study guide for Unit Exam 4, which is your final exam. And then your final opens on May 3rd and 4th. So it'll be open from essentially all day those days. So as soon as it turns to May 3rd, all the way through the end of May 4th. So the day we're supposed to have our final for this class is actually the Tuesday, but it is open both Monday and Tuesday. Since we're not an in-person class, and this is the pattern we've had for all the other exams, it's just easier to have it, I think, for students to fit it around their schedules and have it any time during that. I did try one semester. Basically, there's a 3-hour block that the final is required to cover, but it can be outside that time too. So there was one time I tried to do the final only during that time, and it was just too difficult for students to get to because it was outside of class time. So their work schedules were already scheduled for that kind of thing. So this is better. We'll do that. Probably more information than you needed to know, but that's okay. So as well as that, remember that the final is semi-cumulative. So with it, we do have questions over chapters or units 1, 2, and 3. So do review your study guides for those chapters as well as your exams. If you go to look up your exams and you're not able to see your old answers, let me know as soon as you can. Maybe even go and check that right after class, so then I can change settings. It should let you see those early exams. And then I can just change and fix the settings if it doesn't. So the study guides, and then the study guide for Unit 4 is already up, and we will go over that on Thursday. So hopefully that will help you feel prepared. Again, most of the exam, 60 to 70%, is on Unit 4 material, and then the 30 to 40% is on Units 1, 2, and 3. All right, also don't forget your final question paper. I've already seen a couple of those come in, so I haven't graded any of those yet though. So get those final question papers in before midnight on April 30th. And also your signature assignment and reflection paper and e-portfolio. Hopefully by now you've at least logged into your e-portfolio to get a sense of what it's like. If not, definitely do that as soon as you can. The signature assignment, remember, is an assignment that you've already done for the class, so probably a question paper is what you'll turn in, unless you've done, say, the extra credit on purpose in life or early adulthood friendships. That might fit there. Basically an assignment that really demonstrates your work, the things you've learned in this class, something good you've done. And then your reflection paper is that one page, just kind of summary reflecting on the class, and then you'll put both of those on your e-portfolio. So that is also due the 30th, so quite a few things, probably for other classes that you have as well. There's quite a few things due this week. So make sure you schedule out your time and get these things in. If you want, you can turn in the extra credit question paper. As a reminder for that, it is worth 50 points of extra credit because as many points as a normal question paper, but you definitely have to do a really good job on the extra credit one to get that whole 50 points. If it's shorter than the requirements, if it's only using one reference, you're going to get very few extra credit points versus if you did a really good quality question paper for that. So those extra credit points aren't just because you turned it in. I'll definitely be grading those as well. So questions about these last couple weeks in class, about logistics, about things we've covered in the past, anything like that? All right, well, let's finish up our discussion of late adulthood socio-emotional development in chapter 16. We stopped off talking about the pros and cons of technology last time, and we ended a little early because I didn't feel like there was good places to stop here in families and social relationships. So let's talk about some of the lifestyle diversity. This is kind of a pattern we've seen throughout the chapters. In early adulthood, we talked about marriage rates, divorce rates, things like that. And we're talking about that in middle adulthood and here in late adulthood. So in 2016, about 58% of US adults over 65 were married. So marital satisfaction is generally rated higher for late adults than it is in middle adulthood. Retirement tends to alter couples' lifestyles. Again, there's challenges around retirement that we've talked about at this point. But if they're retired, it generally does alter their lifestyle. They tend to have more leisure time. If they were able to retire, they probably have enough money that they can do other things as well. So with this, older adults married or partnered are usually happier and live longer than those who are single. So when you compare people who are in a partnership in late adulthood to those who are not, the ones who are in a partnership do tend to live longer. So there's a correlation there. Maybe a couple causal variables linking those correlations. So if you have someone who cares and is concerned with you and seeing you very frequently, maybe they can help you better to manage your cognitive faculties. They give you that social support you need, help you monitor medicines, a lot of broad things and simple or day-to-day things as well. So married LGBT individuals 50 years and over report better quality of life and more economic and social resources than unmarried partnered counterparts. So this is specifically married people who are LGBT versus unmarried people who are LGBT. So those who are married in late adulthood reported more economic and social resources and better quality of life. So with this, in 2015, so about 13% of women and 11% of men 65 years and older in the US were divorced or separated. So that number is higher than it's been in previous decades. And so with that, while divorce does have social, financial, and physical consequences, because people on average are living longer, it becomes, I guess, a more viable option to people to get divorced and even get remarried as well in late adulthood. Um, so with that, though, there are these social, financial, and physical consequences that we talked about more in middle adulthood. Those still exist now, but can present additional challenges. So if you did, say, rely on your partner for remembering your medicine, that's an additional challenge you're going to have to remember now. If you have already retired, you might no longer have enough income to stay retired. So some additional challenges in late adulthood, adding on to the challenges that it could bring up in middle adulthood. With this, generally late adults aren't necessarily going to have children in their home. They might even be in a child's home at this point because their children are probably in middle adulthood at this point. So there's not that challenge there. So with this, remarriage is increasing, like I just mentioned a minute ago. And so a lot of this is because, one, rising divorce rates, but that's a lot of that comes from increased longevity as well as better health overall. So if a late adult has better health, if they want to get divorced, they maybe even want to get remarried, it's more of a viable option when they're going to be living another 20, 30, or 40 years in late adulthood. 40 years from late adulthood would be about at 100 or 105. So with this, there's now also a lot more research on cohabitation of late adults. So some of these facts are maybe a little outdated, and we'll talk about that. So in 2016, approximately 3% of older adults were cohabitating, and the statistics suggest, and the interviews suggest, that often this is more for companionship than for love. And so there's a couple things I want to bring up here. Let's think first about the triangle theory of love that we've talked about. It was about 2.5 weeks ago now. So think about that triarchic or triangle theory of love. And this research is saying that older couples are cohabitating for companionship rather than love. What does that mean in relation to the triangle theory of love? Or what would you say about this finding with what you know about that triangle theory of love? So hopefully you're thinking about this. I will pull up a image of the triangle theory of love, but think about this finding. So 3% of older adults were cohabitating. The researchers suggest this was for companionship rather than love. So let's look at the triangle theory of love and talk about it. All right, this one's a pretty good one. So looking at this, what do you think it is that the researchers are saying in relation to the triangle theory of love? They're saying it's more for companionship than love. Where might that fall on this triangle theory of love? All right, we've got a couple comments, and it looked like Mackie had his hand up, so feel free to take over the microphone, Mackie, and then it's probably going to line up with the comments that we're seeing too. But go for it.
I feel like it'd probably be fall somewhere close to companionate love, where intimacy is that sharing of dreams and such, but commitment is that companionship, that help, kind of deal right there.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what the comments are as well, companionate and companionate love. So I think you've all got a pretty good idea of that. So I wanted to point that out because when we talked about the triangle theory of love, companionate love, we tried to talk about as not being more or less, just being a different type of love than this consummate love. So what they're probably saying is, well, now these people might be cohabitating not because of that consummate love or having that passion, but specifically because of this intimacy and commitment together. So very good. I think it's good that you're remembering and understanding that triangle theory. And also it suggests to us that, well, another point is not calling it love, calling it just companionship, I think kind of devalues what it is as well, because companionate love is still love. So I still have liking and commitment with my brother, for example. So we do things for each other, we talk to each other, help each other out, share things about ourselves. So we have that companionate love. So I wouldn't say that that is not important, right? So I still love my sibling, even though I don't have that other aspect of that triangle theory of love there. So with this though, also I do wonder from this research how much of this comes down to also a little bit of ageism in from the researchers' parts and assuming that late adults are not having sex, because late adults, as we saw with some of those longitudinal studies asking people to report the frequency of sex, it does decline a little bit in late adulthood, but there's still very high percentages of people in late adulthood who are still having sex a few times a week, a few times a month, and a few times a year. So passion could definitely still be a part of it, even if it's on average less frequent, because there's still some people who are in the multiple days a week category, even in late adulthood. So this is, I think, one of those aspects of seeing ageism come into this and seeing two theories looked at differently. So the triangle or triarchic theory says, hey, that companionate love is a love. So just wanted to point that out in this finding here. All right. So psychological well-being for these cohabitating couples seems to be higher for men and increase more for men than it does for women who are cohabitating in late adulthood. So also attachment. We've talked about attachment many, many times across this course. So secure attachment, insecure avoidant, those kinds of things. So call your mind back to those. So with this, older adults have fewer attachment relationships in general. We talked about the shrinking of their networks. So they have fewer attachment relationships in general. But with that, anxious attachment styles decrease, and having more attachment anxiety also decreases with age. So perhaps that comes from a little bit more wisdom or just understanding that they need to use their energy for fewer relationships. Perhaps it's also a bit of some of their friends are dying, and so they're losing those connections and accepting that and not being so anxious about those attachments. So attachment security, so having secure attachment style as well as having secure attachments, is associated with greater psychological and physiological well-being than if you have anxious attachment styles or have attachments that are anxious in late adulthood. So there's benefits of secure attachment all throughout the lifespan. So with children and their caregivers, partners, friends, there's a lot of good benefits. So something to do is to work to have secure attachments, especially as you get into late adulthood and those relationships become very essential to keeping up your cognitive faculties. So insecure attachment, on the other hand, is linked to more perceived negative caregiver burden. So if you have an insecure attachment style or feel insecure attachments to other people, it makes it really hard to care for you. It can be a lot more difficult because probably the late adult is not feeling like they can rely on the caregiver. That makes it hard for the caregiver who might be trying to be consistent. I worked with, it wasn't only late adults, but it was people with different mental difficulties. Like one of the patients in literally the house I was working with had schizophrenia. The other one, oh, I forget, because the one I worked with one primary client. But these clients, they had different people working with them day by day, and then there was a high turnover rate. So that can lead to a lot more insecure attachments. I worked there long in comparison, like a long time in comparison to some of the other employees, but I was there a little less than a year. Maybe it was a little more than a year. It was pretty close. It was like 11 to 13 months. But that was long compared to other people who worked there and giving care to these people. They weren't all late adults, but similar things happen in caring for late adults as well. So it can make it hard to have an attachment and think that you can trust your caregivers. So that's a challenge for late adults. All right, let's talk. Oh, you were going to say that too. Oh, that comment came a lot earlier. I think my comments are actually coming through late. So sorry about that. If anyone says a comment and either it doesn't notify me or I just don't see it until later. Sorry about that. So with this, 80% of older adults have children who are in middle adulthood. We talked about this from the middle adults perspective, that oftentimes they will need to be managing the affairs of a late adult, especially towards the end of life. They might have to move the late adult in. It also presents challenges for the late adult themselves. So let's talk about it from their perspective. I think we did talk about this fact too in middle adulthood, but adult daughters are more likely to be more involved in the lives of their aging parents than adult sons. So if we look at some normal distributions at the actual stats, essentially what this is saying is that, let's pretend this is a normal distribution. So like the tallest point, my middle finger, is the mean. And then we've got people that are very, very involved over here and not very involved over here. So there is definitely overlap. So we've got daughters and sons here. There is overlap. So on average, the daughters are slightly higher than the sons in being involved in the lives of their aging parents. So adult children often take the responsibility, especially towards the end of life, of coordinating services, whether that's in a nursing home or in their own home or in the child's home themselves. So wherever the parent is living, oftentimes these families need to coordinate to get the person the care. Maybe they need to go to doctor's appointment on Wednesday, and the child that the late adult lives with is going to be at work, can't take them during that time, so oftentimes they're relying on other siblings. So this can cause conflict for those siblings. It can be challenging and anxiety inducing for the late adult, especially if they're not able to, say, drive themselves to, say, a doctor's appointment in that specific example. So that can be a challenge as well. So in late adulthood, friendships are a little different as well. So new friendships are less likely to be started, and close friends are generally chosen as a place to spend energy and time over new friends. So it takes additional energy, additional time to get to know someone and become a friend with them. So it seems like on average, late adults generally choose, rather than make those new friends, to stick with the friends that they've had for a while. As well as their network is shrinking, so they're already picking and choosing from their friends in many cases to select those relationships that are the most meaningful to them. So friendships do tend to be less problematic in late adulthood than in middle adulthood. You might to put this a different way, you might say late adult friendships have less drama than middle or early adult friendships. So friendships actually are more predictive. So if we look at the correlation of friendships to mental health in late adulthood and family relationships to mental health in late adulthood, we see a higher correlation or a higher predictive value of friendships in late adulthood. So it seems that having good close friends and being involved and engaged with those friends in late adulthood is one of the most important things in late adulthood. So I wanted to bring up again one of the videos that we watched, actually. So hopefully you remember these people. So we talked about this person who is a photographer. We also talked about this person who ran a nonprofit. So I just want to pull up their pictures really quick to remind you of them as we're talking about these topics. So think about these two individuals, the one who is running a nonprofit, and the one who's doing photography. We talked a lot about their personality characteristics last time, but in that video, we didn't see a whole lot of their interactions with friendships, but we did see a little bit of their interactions with people. So with this, individuals with those close ties to friends are less likely to die across a 7-year time span. So essentially what this was is a longitudinal study, looked at people. One of the things they measured were close friendships and the number of friendships. People who had closer and more friendships, 7 years later, when they followed up with these people, were less likely to be dead than the other participants who didn't have as many or didn't have as strong of friendships. So it seems to be a really critical piece of cognitive health, of supporting physical health as well, being engaged with those friends. So it's a really critical piece. And this is really important if we consider both Bronfenbrenner's model and theory of bioecological human development, as well as Vygotsky's sociocultural theory of human development. Each of those looks at a person embedded in a network of individuals. So right now in this class, we're part of each other's networks. I come to class every week and you come to class every week, and we see each other, we communicate with each other, we interact. So we're part of each other's networks. But then you'll probably move to other classes next semester. Next semester I'll probably be teaching this class again. So I won't be seeing you in other classes because I won't be teaching those classes. So you'll have a new network. Same with late adults. They've moved through their lives through different networks of people, having different friends, different family living close to them, things like that. So with Vygotsky's sociocultural theory, one of the primary ideas there is that from the people around us, that's how we learn, that's how we see models of behavior, we learn tools of a culture. So one that I always think of when we talk about tools of the culture is math. We learn math, we learn language, we learn how things work in the area, as well as Bronfenbrenner's model. So we've got the microsystem is that immediate networks. So this idea of late adults getting support, giving support, and being within this connected network is in both of those developmental theories. Vygotsky's, I mean, Lerner's as well. But I think Bronfenbrenner's model in this specific instance is a really good image to show the individual is within this system of social networks. So in this case, I like Bronfenbrenner's for its imagery in that sense. So we're always within these networks. And so late adults might have a church, might have community things that they're involved with. Maybe they're volunteering in the community. Maybe they run a nonprofit, like that example we saw in the video. They have some family and some friends that they're interacting with on a daily, weekly, monthly, or yearly basis. So that all has an impact on the supports that they have access to, the challenges that they have, who they can give support to, those kinds of things. All right. So let's talk specifically about altruism and volunteering. One of the main reasons for it is because I like this topic. It's one of my favorite topics across the lifespan. Altruism, volunteering, civic engagement. My first advisor in grad school tried to convince me to do to forget heroism and focus on civic engagement. Had I done that, I'd probably be done with a PhD at this point. But at least I'm doing the thing I really want to do. Although they were a smart advisor, that probably a good idea. I would have had a lot less student debt. Sorry to bring up student debt at all. So older adults with persistently low or declining feelings of usefulness towards others are at an increased risk of early death. So volunteering is one really good way for older adults to be meaningfully involved in something around them that gives on beyond themselves. It doesn't necessarily have to be a purposeful thing. We've talked about purpose being goal orientation, meaningfulness, and that beyond the self-concern. So it definitely could be something purposeful. But just giving back in general, going for a weekend and planting trees on Earth Day or something like that is a really meaningful thing to do. When you feel like you're useful, you're going to have better mental health, better physical health. You'll probably be interacting with more people, so you'll have those supports. And so when you feel like you're useful to other people, you stick around and are alive longer. So volunteering is associated with a lot of benefits that affect this. So you're generally doing constructive activities and productive roles. A lot of the volunteering literature looks at volunteering for like political campaigns. It often looks volunteering for healthcare, like increasing access to healthcare. Like one of my other advisors does a lot of work in people that are volunteering in the area to get people care for AIDS and support for AIDS and HIV. Another one is community involvement through, say, like churches or other organizations that help people who are homeless or help the environment in the area. So those are some of the most common areas looked at and researched in volunteering. So those are some that we have the most research on for late adults, and it gives them a lot of constructive activities. It can also give them a lot of social integration. There's probably other people they're doing this with. They might have different roles in that. They might be a mentor to some of the people who are just coming in if they've been doing it for a while. They might run the nonprofit, like the example in the video that we showed. So with that, they can make new friends, even though they might be less likely to do that in late adulthood, but they can be generative. So volunteering is a really good way to keep their cognitive capacities up, interacting with people in a social environment, doing things that are meaningful and things that they enjoy. So let's move to talking about ethnicity, gender, and culture. There's quite a few points to make on in here, but one of the big ones is that when we look at late adulthood, that's already a challenge. So that's already they've already got ageism there. So if you're an ethnic minority that's in late adulthood, you might be facing both ageism and racism. So, and it's like a 1-2 punch there. And then we'll talk about gender in a minute too. So depending on your gender, you might also be stigmatized as well. So let's say you're an ethnic minority in late adulthood and a woman, or say transgender. That's going to be a lot more risk factors. So Black Americans and Latinx people are overrepresented in poverty statistics because of the systematic racism that's existed. So it is hard to distinguish those ethnicities from SES in many times, but the main point here is that these give them additional challenges. So if you're Black and a late adult, you have additional challenges that aren't necessarily going to be faced by all groups of people. So you have that 1-2 punch there. So with that, you're more likely to become ill and less likely to be able to receive treatment. Maybe the community that you're in doesn't have as many resources. Maybe the hospitals aren't as good or as well staffed. So a lot of different things. Also, this is the stat that comes from the text, is you may never reach the eligible age for Social Security and Medicare benefits, which is a really clinical way of saying that when you have these additional risk factors, you're far more likely to die before you ever get to the age where you are eligible for Social Security and Medicare. So it's kind of a big deal. It's said in a kind of clean clinical way, but we're talking about death there. I mean, that's what we'll be talking about all in chapter 17 too. So with this, we talked about, when we were talking about immigration it was either adolescence or late adulthood chapter, we talked briefly about the immigrant risk and immigrant paradox model. Some of that same research is really applicable here. So even though not all these ethnic minorities are going to be immigrants, some of them may be. Some of those same findings apply. While we might expect that these challenges and risks present a lot of detriments. So if we think about developmental cascades or just additional things maybe piling up to make it more likely to lead to negative outcomes, just like the immigrant risk model. For immigrant risk model, it was things like not being able to know the language or learn the language or navigate the systems in the new place, and not having a family system to support you. Those kinds of things could lead possibly immigrants in the immigrant risk model to be less likely to succeed in the new place they've immigrated to. Versus the immigrant paradox model was saying, well, that's not what we see from everybody, especially for children and adolescents and early adults. We see them thriving and doing really, really well after immigrating. They become more resilient. Maybe they're able to learn the language really quickly, able to navigate things well. So we see these positive benefits and gaining capacities to offset those negatives. So they gain some capacities in that developmental cascade model to push them more towards positive outcomes. So we see some of those same things at play here, even though there might be that 1-2 or 1-2-3 punch of these additional possible challenges. There are things that a lot of people can do to develop coping mechanisms for survival, especially here in late adulthood. So this is called this way the happiness paradox. Even though there's a lot of challenges, they've developed more resilience, other supports to get through these things. One of the big common things for people who are ethnic minorities, as well as in late adulthood, is their extended family networks are relied on more than people who are in late adulthood and not ethnic minorities. As well as churches for these ethnic minorities often become a center for either finding resources like in a community or the direct place they're getting resources in their community. So it's a really common way that they get support from their community. So with this is an interesting finding that I wanted to talk about and reference literature in psychology in general. So the finding that it talks about in your book is from older research that suggests there might be decreasing femininity in women and decreasing masculinity in men during late adulthood. So the stats they give are that older men may become more feminine. So they're defining that as nurturing or more sensitive. So when they're comparing in cross-sectional or longitudinal studies, middle adult men to late adult men, they're saying they're scoring higher on these traits, nurturing or sensitive. And so they're saying they're becoming more feminine. So you might already see some problems with this language. So the other stat here is that older women do not necessarily become more masculine. That is, they're defining that by traits of assertive or dominant compared to middle adulthood. So there's a couple things to point out here. One is that they're attributing these specific traits, being nurturing or sensitive or assertive or dominant, as being either masculine or feminine on that gender binary. Another thing is this research originally probably only had two gender options, either male or female. It might have even asked for sex rather than gender, even though it's reporting. Remember, we've talked about that before. In earlier psychology studies, it wasn't as easy to determine, it wasn't as understood that it was needed as well, that you needed to really delineate whether you're talking about gender versus a biological sex as well. There's more than one biological sex too, but we've talked about that before. So this really shows some of the things in psychology that have changed over time. So our understanding of gender. For example, just the other day, I was updating my dissertation study to include multiple gender terms. I ended up with 10 descriptions, 10 different genders that could be selected from. And that was the recommendation from the APA. There are other genders that I could have added, but these were the ones that the APA is like, hey, at this point in time, this is what we recommend. So that's what I was going with. So with this, at this time that this research was done, they probably just had the two, male and female. So what about bigender people or agender people or gender non-conforming people? They're either not responding to that question or they're picking one that's maybe closest to what they identify with. So research method problem that led to and contributed to some stats like this and findings like that. Probably a more accurate way to talk about this finding now today would be that the people who in the study identified as men, in between the time that we compare middle and late adults, they seem to be ranking higher on the traits of being nurturing and sensitive, versus women do not necessarily have any change in their nurturing or sensitivity scores or their assertiveness or dominance scores. So that's probably a better way to describe that finding now, but I definitely wanted to point it out because it's still in your book in this way. And I think it shows kind of the path that we've learned in psychology and how things are changing and getting better, being more representative. So like I mentioned just the other day, I put 10 gender terms into the survey for people to have additional options. 5 years, 20 years from now, maybe I'll have lots more gender terms for people to select. Yeah, questions about that, comments about that? Oh, sorry, I had my microphone muted. Let me know if you can hear me. My internet died here, and so it dropped the call. I look like I'm back to me now. Can anybody hear me though?
Yeah, you're good.
All right, great. Wanted to make sure. All right, well, with the time then, hopefully you could still hear what I was talking about at the end there. I asked for any questions about gender and the research in psychology, especially in relation to this specific finding. Actually, it's probably not sharing my screen anymore, is it? So there is the screen. So were there any questions on that while I was gone? All right, I definitely want to show you really quickly. Here's my IRB application. So here are the genders I included, or I'm including in this scale, if it was of interest to anybody. So you can see, was this 10? 1, 2, 3. Okay, 10 including other. So it's good to have something like other, especially when you're talking about gender or ethnicity, so someone can fill it in themselves. So yeah, if you were curious, what would all those 10 genders be that were recommended by the APA? That is them. Definitely, especially in my studies, so last point on this, definitely in my studies, the largest sample I'm going to be collecting is a sample of 400 people. So probably out of those 400 people, I'll get about 80% or more that probably say one of these two genders. So I'm definitely not going to be getting big enough samples to say anything about the handful of people who are agender or bigender or genderqueer or non-binary, so on and so forth, in this study on its own. That's why if you're really interested in the topic, it will definitely be useful to look at gender studies specifically. Hopefully you've already picked a topic for your final question paper. Maybe you've even turned it in. But if that's of interest to you, looking at gender in psychology, looking specifically at the research and researchers who work on that, you can find more information about all of these genders and the research connected to it, versus in my study, unless I get a lot more people than I'm planning, I probably won't be able to say too much about anyone other than cisgender men and cisgender women from my study. So a change in the field in general to understand and do a better job at understanding people in general. All right, so with that, you could face ageism, sexism, and racism. So triple jeopardy or a triple punch, that can be a challenge. So again, with these developmental cascades, that doesn't mean that you are doomed to have negative outcomes in late adulthood if you fall under all these categories, just that those are additional challenges that one, community supports can help overcome, other cultural supports, other things, but it's going to take more work generally than someone who doesn't have those additional challenges. If you're also disabled at the same time, it's an additional challenge. So hopefully you're understanding developmental cascades since we've brought it up so many times now. So with this, let's move to culture and a little bit of differences in cultures. We've talked about this a little bit. So for example, the culture in Okinawa, Japan, leading to a lot of people who are living to over 100. So things that are factors that are really important for living a long and good life in late adulthood are health, security, and kinship or support. So kinship and support, friendships, relationships with family, that all goes in there. Health is related to as well, because if you need help getting to medical care or things like that, family or friends can support you as there. And having security, so being in a safe place, are some of the three most important pieces. So also factors that are likely to predict high status for older adults. So older adults who are seen as high status individuals are those who have valuable knowledge, who might be able to mentor other people. If you have control over family and community resources, so maybe you're a mayor or you have more money in the family, you might be seen as having higher status. If you are still engaging in basically the same kinds of things you were doing in middle adulthood, if you're still working in your nonprofit, like the example we saw in the video, if you're doing the same things still into late adulthood, you will be seen as higher status. Try to keep that role continuity. It's really good for mental health, for physical health, for cognitive health. So that's one of the biggest takeaways as you get into late adulthood, to consider that. One, focus on your friendships and focus on still being engaged with people and the community and life around you. Try to keep those same roles in late adulthood that you have in middle. All right, so with that, Some other cultures have different values around late adulthood. Some give adults greater responsibility or less responsibility, greater authority or less responsibility, greater advisory capacity or less. So we've talked about, actually in that video, the person running the nonprofit said that we don't really have as much reverence for late adults in this culture as we do in other cultures. With that, she mentioned she doesn't know that it's necessarily essential for that reverence to be there, but if we still have them as a part of the community, that's a really important piece, is what they were saying. But extended family can also has a different role depending on the culture. Some cultures, responsibilities that the late adult will be doing are in the extended family. So maybe they're caring for younger children, mentoring other people in the extended family. Versus in the U.S., extended families are not relied on as much as many other cultures. And then, like we mentioned, respect for older adults, depending on your culture, might be higher or lower. And so with that, if you're not respected, if you're not called on to take responsibility or to be an authority or to be an advisor or to support a family or to support people in the community, you might, like we talked about at the beginning of today, feel like you're less useful. So these kind of cultural differences can have a really big impact on how important or how useful a late adult feels. If they don't feel like they're useful, if they're not able to actually engage and support other people, they will probably not live as long. They're going to have decreased mental health, decreased physical health, decreased cognitive health. So that's why some of these aspects, we can look at other cultures and maybe make some changes to have less ageism and see late adults as being as responsible as they can and doing things that they can do. All right, so this is the video that we watched. In this class, we watched it first so we could talk back about it again. So with this, for successful aging, so let's give a quick summary of the chapter, some things that we talked about in both middle and late adulthood that are essential are proper diet, active lifestyle, mental stimulation and flexibility, learning new tricks, new tools, new games, doing apps, positive coping skills. So coping skills can include other people or also your own emotion regulation, good social relationships and support, so family and definitely friends as you get into late adulthood, and the absence of disease. So proactive engagement, having resources, having a positive attitude or spirit towards things, and having valued relationships are some of the biggest factors. So here's a couple different things that you can do and change, and these are some of the biggest factors for successful aging. So remember those as you get into late adulthood as well, to focus on those kinds of things as the primary things to give your energy to, so you'll live a longer and happier life. And I think that is the end of this chapter. Yes, it is. So let's take a quick break before we dive into chapter 17. Chapter 17 is on death, dying, and the end of life. So what are the processes at the end of life? What's it like for the family? Grief, the processes of grief, the stages of death and dying and grieving. So that's what we'll be talking about. If you have a family member that has recently died or is seriously ill or something like that, it could be a challenge to listen and talk about these topics. So I totally understand if you need to take a break. Honestly, I should probably give that disclaimer one of the first weeks of class, is that anything can be relevant to your life when we're talking about lifespan. So with that, it can definitely instigate an existential crisis when you're thinking about the end of your life or the end of other people's lives around you. So if it's tough to listen to, feel free to come back and review the notes later on. But we'll take a break and then we'll come back and jump into chapter 17. So come back at 10:56 and we'll jump into chapter 17. All right. Well, we are back. So let's jump into chapter 17. I already gave my disclaimer. This is on death, dying, and grieving. So it can be a challenging chapter. So let's first talk about the definition of death. So, what is death? When is someone dead? Well, we've used a couple different measures or operational definitions of death in the past. So, one that's been very common over many, many millennia, for what we can tell from humans, is when breathing ceases. So, if you look at even earlier medical records, before people learned about resuscitation techniques, when breathing stopped, that person was considered dead. Versus, you've probably had a CPR class, you know that even if breathing stops, a person's brain continues functioning, their body might still be functioning, and they might be able to be resuscitated through something like CPR. So that was at one point a definition of death, is when breathing stopped. Another is blood pressure. So having your blood pressure drop below a certain level, or having essentially very low blood pressure, was at some points defined as being dead. Rigor mortis, the rigidity of the body, was another definition used. So making sure that someone was dead at that point. So these are a couple different ways we've defined it in the past. And there's still, even now, isn't 100% agreement from all medical researchers about at what point should we define death. But we'll talk about one that is most agreed on, and then the caveats to it. So that is brain death. So brain death is when all electrical activity in the brain has ceased for a specific period of time. I believe your book mentions the period of time. I didn't put it on the slide. If anyone can check it really quick and put it in the comments, that would be awesome. But I think I'm thinking 7 minutes, but I think that's actually the amount of time your brain can go without oxygen before it experiences brain death. So I think I'm getting some numbers confused there. So if you remember or look it up or in your book right now, definitely do put it in the chat. So essentially what this would be is, if you're monitoring someone's brain activity, they would have a flat EEG for a specified amount of time. So that is currently a major criterion for brain death. So with that, it generally, legally in many places in the US, brain death is considered both the higher cortical functions, so basically the emotion center, well, before I say the kinds of, the wrinkly part of your brain, this upper portion, when that is said, that's the higher cortical functions. And then lower brainstem functions are those things that are going on right here that are keeping you alive, keeping your heart pumping and things like that. So in many, many places, the definition of death is the lower and higher brain functions. Generally, the higher brain functions would go and the lower could stay. I guess I could assume it could be possible, depending on the injury, that you could have lower brainstem function cease, but higher brainstem function or higher cortical functions, some of them work, but it's got to pass through the brainstem. So maybe that's not the case. Yeah, anyway, but that is brain death. But it isn't totally agreed upon. Some medical researchers recommend the cessation of the higher cortical functions. So think about that, everything above the brainstem, that is what should be defined as brain death. And that the brainstem might still be running and still working properly, pumping your heart, so on and so forth. So what are the areas of the brain, or what are the functions of the higher cortical portion of the brain? What is that? What are the responsibilities of that area of the brain? The higher cortical functions, everything above the brain stem, essentially. What's going on up there? Any guesses of things at the higher cortical functions of the brain? So what's going on in the wrinkly portion of the brain, the very middle of the brain, basically anything over this brain stem. What's going on there? So what kind of functions are they talking about defining as brain death? When what functions cease? Well, maybe no one's back from break. We'll continue talking about it. So with that, the higher cortical functions of the brain, that's where your prefrontal cortex is up here. So planning, goal setting, that stopped at higher cortical function stopping. Emotion center of your brain, that's part of the higher, it's like right here in the very middle. Language processed over here, motion, feeling things, so like feeling something pinch your hand, that's done, well, if it's this hand I'm pinching, I would actually be feeling it over here. Those are some of the higher cortical functions. So a lot of your brain activity that you're experiencing and making you, other than just those survival things, are the higher cortical functioning. All right, so with this, what do we do at the end of life? How can we plan for the care that we need? This is called advanced life care planning. So generally, this is something that a patient or a person should do. So you, individual, any student, me, myself, I haven't actually done this yet. It's always kind of every year I'm like, oh, I do need to do that. And then I come back and I do this lecture again. I'm like, oh my gosh, I still haven't done that. I need to do it. So plan and communicate your preferences for end-of-life care. And it's a challenging conversation to have. It's a hard thing to think about, but it's important to, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why. So living wills are one option. So essentially a living will is a legal document that talks a little bit about medical care that a person would want. They might give a power of attorney to someone as well. That's another option. An advance directive is more medically specific document that says these are the specific kinds of care that I want and for how long I would want them. So if you want a transfusion or resuscitation or to be put on a respirator, or you don't want one or more of those things, you can state it specifically. So the advance directive is more specific about those medical procedures. Living will is can talk about medical procedures as well. And also there's power of attorney, giving that power to, say, a partner or a friend to make those choices when you're not capable of making that yourself. So it can be important to do this, especially for late adults, if they haven't yet, because they're coming towards the end of life. One of the biggest challenges in caring for a late adult is the family members wanting to give them more care than they necessarily want themselves. And so when the patient isn't able to state what care they want, or they don't have a legal document saying this is what I want to happen, it can be difficult for doctors and for the family members. Some family want more measures taken and some family don't. That can cause a lot of conflict and be very challenging for the doctor to go back and forth, or the nurse, probably the nurse, honestly, we're talking about here. They do a lot of that, of the talking to the families. So let's watch this little video that goes into more detail, because these are essentially very focused legal documents that have specific parts. So let's watch this video to learn a little more about this, and it's really good so that you can know what you're coming up to do when you make a living will or other advance directives. So let's talk about them in more detail in this video.
Advanced care directives. Patients have a right to take an active role in their own health care. Unfortunately, there are times, such as sudden illness or an accident, when this is not possible. Advanced care planning, under the Patient Self-Determination Act, PSDA 1990, gives a patient his right to make determinations regarding their medical care in advance, based on personal values, attitudes, illness, and death. Patients have a right to make medical decisions regarding their treatment, appoint an agent to speak on their behalf, when incapacitated, determine or refuse their medical treatment and care. Two commonly used advance directives are living will and power of attorney. The living will. A living will tells medical professionals and your family which medical treatments you want to receive or refuse, and under what conditions. There are two parts. In Part 1, you are asked to provide instructions concerning your future health care. In Section B and C, you may state the circumstances in which various forms of medical treatment should be provided, withheld, or discontinued. You are asked to give specific instructions regarding two types of life-sustaining measures: artificially provided fluids, and nutrition and cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Section D needs additional instructions about your healthcare preferences that are important to you, and which may help those concerned with your care to implement your wishes. Section E is about brain death. The state of New Jersey recognizes the irreversible cessation of all functions of the brain as a legal standard for the declaration of death. Section F allows you to indicate your desire to make an anatomical gift and provide instructions for any limitations or special uses for the same. While Part 2 contains signatures and witnesses, generally, a living will does not appoint an agent. However, the witness should be at least 18 years of age or older. Healthcare power of attorney. This form of advance directive allows you to select a family member or a friend as the decision maker regarding healthcare issues. A healthcare power of attorney pertains to healthcare matters only and allows you to specify in writing the types of care you do and do not want to receive. In Section A, you choose a healthcare representative or agent who will represent you to make decisions on your behalf in accordance with your wishes, as stated in the document. Section B is for designating alternate representatives in case the nominated person is unable, unwilling, or unavailable to act as your healthcare representative. Section C specifies directions to best express your wishes. Section D, E, and F are similar to that of living will, comprising of your signatures and that of the witnesses. By completing an advance directive, you can help avoid potentially destructive disputes, ease decision-making on loved ones, and avoid unwanted medical procedures. In addressing the creation of an advance directive, competent legal counsel should be consulted. Clinic Spectrum, healthier business.
So that gives a lot of detail on living wills and other advance directives to give you an idea of what you might want to do. So I definitely encourage you, even though I talk about this at least yearly and still haven't done them myself, have conversations with people around you, look up the research on and just different websites as well about living wills as well as other advance directives so that you can make a plan, so that you can know what kind of care you would want, at what times, for how long, so that other people around you can know, and then do take the steps to make that a legal document. You'll essentially get that signed with a notary or a lawyer, and then give it to your doctor. So then if, say, you were in a car crash or you were at the end of life, your doctor would be able to, when the hospital goes and tries to get your medical records, they would have that with them. And so they would have that advance directive saying these are the care things that you want, that you, even if you're incapable of talking or communicating yourself, you've already put it in writing, so the doctors can know exactly what you have consented to with your own body. So that's the big key here. And it has a lot of other benefits too. So it's really, really helpful for family members. We'll talk on the next slide that family members generally like or want to give more care to their family members than the person wants themselves. So it's hard because family members, they might fight, they might argue. It adds an additional piece of stress and anxiety and conflict that doesn't need to be there. If there's a person dying, that's already going to be a challenging time enough. You don't need to add on family members fighting about how much care grandma should get, for example. Doctors and nurses really like advanced care directives. It makes it so much easier for them to know exactly what they can and cannot do. It means they don't have to be a go-between between those fighting families. It means that in a hospital setting, for example, and this will come up again in this lecture, in a hospital setting, their goal is to extend life, to save and extend life. So some doctors, they might really want to use every single kind of method available in the system we have. That means probably going to be really expensive, and that burden's going to fall on the family members. It might be really traumatic for the patient, even if they do survive it. So like the treatments that they get might lead for that patient, even though they're still alive, maybe their quality of life is not what they would have wanted for themselves. So this is why advance directives are really good. It gives those doctors and nurses really clear point of this is what this patient has consented to and not. And then it doesn't have to go into the doctor's hands of what they want or what they think at all. If the life-saving procedure is something that the person has agreed to, they do that life-saving procedure. If the doctor thinks this life-saving procedure would work, but the person has not consented to have that done, they don't do it. And that was that person's choice. I mean, it's still probably not easy for the doctors or nurses watching people die, but at least they know this was that person's choice. They're being respectful of that person's wishes. So it's very helpful for family. It's very helpful for healthcare professionals. So with this is also connected to the topic of euthanasia. So when I was an adolescent, well, I guess up until the point where I was an adolescent, I used to think this was 3 separate words. And I'm curious if anyone else in the class did as well. I thought it was youth, so Y-O-U-T-H, in, so I-N, and then Asia, A-S-I-A, so like the location, the continent of Asia, youth in Asia. Then I learned in adolescence that that's not what it was at all, that it's one word, and the definition of that is the act of painlessly ending the lives of an individual suffering from an incurable disease or severe disabilities. So very different than what I thought. So made the contextual, I didn't pick up on the context clues when I was younger. I'm curious if anybody else had that experience. A little embarrassing, but also a little bit funny. So with this, passive euthanasia is when treatment is withheld. So if a person is on a respirator, removing that respirator, pulling the plug on the respirator, letting the person die naturally when the treatment is removed. Versus active euthanasia is when death is deliberately induced. Most often, in most places, this is done with a lethal dose of a drug. So it might be a painkiller, for example, is fairly common. Just getting a very, very high dose of a painkiller is often poisonous and lethal. So if you look at this, I made this slide about 2 years ago, so it's very possible that these countries and the laws may have changed by this time. So if you're interested, definitely look it up. We've got Canada, Montana, the west coast of the U.S., where active euthanasia is legal. Most of the U.S. outside of that has passive euthanasia legal. We've got some other countries around the world in Europe where passive euthanasia is legal. We do have places like Mexico as well as Australia, who at least at the time of making this, that euthanasia was illegal entirely in most of the places. So definitely look up current laws. I'm not sure if Colorado, for example, if active euthanasia is still legal there. I could probably just ask my cousin who's a nurse in Colorado. I'm sure she would know, or Google. I bet Google would know too. So with that being said, how long should life be sustained artificially? So how long should a person be on a respirator? How long should they be on other medical treatments to keep their body running or their brain running and getting nutrients? There's a lot of different ways to keep a person, even after brain death, to keep a body still living. The heart pumping, blood flowing, muscles getting nutrients and things like that, even stimulating muscles. So how long should that be done? This is a really personal question. There's not really one clear answer that applies to everybody. This is something, as well as with the living will and the treatments that are important to you to be done, you really need to give some thought to. So for you, maybe you don't want any life-sustaining artificially. You don't want to be on a respirator for whatever reason. Maybe you want to be for a very long period of time for whatever reason. So there's this is a really personal thing, so I encourage you to think about that, to look into it in more detail about the types of life-saving procedures, so then you can go and make an advance directive so it's really clear what you want. You can always change those documents later too. If you change your mind and maybe you said, hey, I don't want a respirator, but then you decide, oh, actually, I think I would, you can go and change those documents as well. It makes it a lot easier, though, for, again, family and the doctors. So one example of this that's often used is that of Terri Schiavo, who was kept alive in a vegetative state, so brain death, for 15 years. Eventually, passive euthanasia was used, and they were allowed to die. So, but for 15 years, the family mostly, I mean, you can watch whole documentaries on this situation, but mostly the family just wanted to keep doing care in the hopes to extend life. And that's a big key here when we're talking about the end of life and what care people need and should get, is that on average, most family members want more care, whereas if the patient themselves prefers less care if they talk about it before the situation happens. So let's say outside of any illness, any emergency, any death, a whole family comes and sits down to do a survey. On this survey, they are asked, which of these life-saving procedures would you like for yourself and for how long? So they mark that. Then next they say, which of these life-saving procedures would you want for your cousin or your partner or your grandma or your father or something like that? So they ask those questions. Generally, people answer for other people, so for their family members, for those close to them, that they want more care. So they report wanting more and longer care than they want themselves. So this is a really common finding. And so this can create a lot of challenge. Some of these life-saving procedures, even if survived, can lead to serious trauma and a lower quality of life later on. So it really should be up to the person, the individual themselves, which life-saving treatments they want. So definitely take the time to think about it. I know it's not necessarily a fun thing to think about your own death and the deaths of family members, but it is definitely a very important thing. And we'll talk about the processes of grief and other things that family goes through next time. Assisted suicide is another thing. Patients self-administering usually a lethal dose of medication. Canada, Switzerland, Colombia, Netherlands, Belgium, Oregon, Washington, Montana, Vermont, New Mexico, California. At the time of making this slide, it was legal to do assisted suicide in those places. So we'll start off here next time we come to class. I know we're in a chapter on death, dying, and the death process. So not really a happy note to end on, other than think about the care that you would want at the end of your life. Think about these advanced directives and start working on that if you haven't already. And I'll try to take my advice this time and actually do it as well. So thanks for being here in class today. Have a great rest of your day.